All right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
What was that?
That was my computer blowing up.
Oh, thought we're having sound effects in class this morning. All right. Hey, James, would you mind hitting the door, please? Well, preferably close it. Hitting it may not be. You know, you find when you have small children that you have to be quite literal about things that you say because they take everything so literally. So there will be times when we're trying to get ready for bed and Stacy will say, "Okay, girls, run upstairs and brush your..." No, don't run. Don't run. That's not what we meant. Go upstairs. All right. Where is everybody? The rain? Come on.
It takes longer to hitch up the horse to the...
Yeah. Hitch up the wagon, right? All right. So who remembers the term for the original documents written by the inspired apostles and prophets? What were those called? Remember? The autographs, all right? So the autographs. And of those original 66 autographs, how many of them do we have available to us today? 0. All right. What happened to them? Well, they were either destroyed by persecutors and conquerors, or they simply deteriorated over time after lots and lots of distribution and use, or they're just missing for some other reason. I want to suggest that possibly, though, God providentially made it so that we would not have any of the autographs today. If we did, what do you think we would do with it?
Worship.
We would worship it. Yes, that's exactly what we would do with it. And so maybe, I'm not claiming this as truth, but I think we need to be open to the possibility that maybe God didn't want us to have the autographs. So, if we don't have the original documents, then how can we possibly know what the original documents said? And so answering that question is the scholarly field of textual criticism. You can get multiple advanced degrees in this field, textual criticism. So let's talk a little bit about that this morning. What is it? Why is it important? What do we do with this? Now, I struggled with how to go about this lesson because, as I said, you can get advanced degrees in this. So what can I possibly say in a 35-minute class that would be sufficient for us to help us understand? And I could give you all kinds of examples, biblical examples of passages that are disputed and talk about how a textual critic goes about thinking about those and all of that. That's all interesting and fascinating, but it's also pretty academic. And I don't have time to go into that. So I'm going to just use some simple secular illustrations that may help us understand the idea of textual criticism. All right. What is it? Textual criticism is simply this. It's the process of recovering the original text based upon the evidence that you have in your possession. So we've got copies of copies of copies available to us. How do we use those to reconstruct the autograph? That's what textual criticism is. Okay? So, there's a really fascinating history to this field, and especially as it applies to Scripture, but again, it's a little more technical than I want to pursue. So, let me give you a very simple secular illustration that will help us think about what a textual critic does. I want you to suppose there was an older man. Let's say he's 75 years old. He's a widower. And he's chronically ill. So this aged man has decided to get with an estate attorney and draft a will because he's never done one before. So he's making these legal preparations for his estate that upon his death, this will be executed. So he meets his attorney, he meets his will, and he decides that his estate will be divided up like this. His only son will receive 80% of his estate. The remaining 20% will be divided up between two of his nephews, each of them receiving 10%. The original will is drafted by the attorney. The autograph is drafted by the attorney. And that original was copied one time and given to the son, while the autograph remained in a lockbox in the home of the father. So we have the autograph that's in the man's home, and we have one copy of the autograph. Now, unfortunately, the father's house burned down through an electrical fire, and the autograph was lost. So what do we do to figure out what the autograph said? You get the one copy. Okay? Now that's an extremely simplified illustration. So let me make it a little more complicated. Let's change the scenario a little bit and let's make it a little bit more involved. I want you to imagine this kind of scenario unfolding in the ancient world, not modern times where we have computers and Xerox machines. So instead of having just one son, this 75-year-old chronically ill man has 6 children. So he decides that 80% of his estate will be equally divided among the 6 children. And the 2 nephews, again, will get the remaining 20%. Each child, 6 of them, and the 2 nephews will make their own personal copy of the autograph. So how many copies are there? 8. We got 6 children and the 2 nephews. That's 8 copies plus the autograph. So we have 9. Okay? Now, one of the children says, I don't like those nephews. I don't think it's fair that they should get that 20%. I think we children should get this. So as he is making his personal copy of the autograph, instead of copying the autograph, he conveniently writes out the nephews. They get nothing. So upon the father's death, the family comes together to sort out the estate. And the greedy son makes his case. This is what the will says. How do you sort this out? How do you sort it out, especially in the event that the autograph is no longer available? You know, the father buried it in a time capsule in the backyard and now no one can find it. How do you sort it out? You bring together all 8 copies and you compare them. And in this case, again, overly simple illustration, but in this case, do you feel pretty confident that you can figure out what the original will said? Yeah. You've got 7 copies that all say the same thing, and you've got one rogue copy over here that's completely different. That's pretty simple to figure out. So, you take the available evidence that you have, and you work backwards. You follow me? Okay. So, When textual critics sit down to do this work, what would you think would make it more easy for you to do your job? You would think that the more copies you have, the more likely you are to reconstruct the autograph, right? Okay, and that's exactly right. You want as much possible material as you can gather to see how they agree or disagree, and the more copies, manuscripts, the more evidence you have, the better, because you can work backwards and more accurately construct the original. So, the number of copies that you have available is really important. But that's not the only criteria that's really important. So I have a chart here I want to share with you. And on this chart, I'm going to compare the New Testament documents with other ancient historical texts. So if you can see this chart, we've got a bunch of column headings. We have 5 column headings. On the left, you have the author. Secondly, you have the document, the book that they wrote, or the writing, whatever the text it is that we're trying to reconstruct. The third column is the date that it was written. And then the last 2 columns are especially important when you're trying to reconstruct the autograph. So the fourth column says, time to the earliest existing manuscript in years. So, when was the date, or when was the document written? The original, when was the autograph written? That's pretty easy to figure out. Who wrote the document? This guy. Oh, when did he live? He lived in this time period. Okay, now we know when the autograph was written, right? When was it written? And let's look at all the copies of it that we have. How old is the oldest copy? And how many years of time are there in between the two? Okay, that's what the fourth column is. And then the last column is, how many copies do we have? So let's look at some ancient, secular, historical documents, and we'll compare those to the New Testament. The Greek poet Homer, you've probably heard of him before. He wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay? Homer wrote the Iliad in 800 BC. How many years was it from the date of the original to the earliest copy? How many years passed? 400 years. So the earliest copy of Homer's Iliad that we have is from 400 BC. 400 years of time from the autograph to the earliest copy that we have. You follow me? All right. How many copies of Homer's Iliad do we have? 643. Now, those are not complete. Have any of you ever read the Iliad? Okay. It's pretty big, isn't it? It's a huge book, and the Odyssey is as well. It's huge. We're not talking about 643 completed full text copies. There's some, but mostly we're talking about fragments, small little pieces, okay? And it might be carved on a stone, it might be written on wood, some of those other ancient book forms that we talked about in an earlier class. 643 copies, that's really impressive. For a document that's this old, to have 643 copies is really impressive. All right, next document, Demosthenes, the Philippics. This is a series of speeches that he gave against Philip II of Macedon. These were like political speeches against the opponent, okay? He wrote these 350 to 322, somewhere in that time frame. The earliest copy that we have, though, is 1400 years after the autograph. 14 centuries after the autograph. And we have 200 copies. That's still pretty good. The number of copies, 200, is still pretty good in comparison to some of the other documents that we're going to see. But notice the difference. Homer's earliest copy, 400 years later. Demosthenes, 1400 years later. That's a huge span of time. All right? Here's another one. Livy's History of Rome, written 59 BC to 17 AD in that time period. How many years to the earliest copy? 400 years. And how many copies do we have? Just 20. I'm listing these not in chronological order of date written, but in the descending order of how many copies we have. Notice how far we've dropped off. 643 copies down to now just 20 for Livy's History of Rome. All right? Tacitus, another Roman historian, the Annals of Imperial Rome, written in 100 AD. The earliest copy that we have is from 1,000 years later. 1100 AD is the earliest copy that we have, and we, again, have 20 copies. 20 is not very much, is it?
Especially if you consider that they're not all a full.
Yes, yeah, that's right. When they're not all full copies, that's right. All right, let's look at the next one. Caesar, by the way, Caesar in Latin was actually Kaiser, although we say Caesar. It's a hard C in Latin. Caesar wrote the Gallic Wars in 100 to 44 BC. The earliest copy that we have is from 1,000 years later, and we have 10 copies. Okay? 10. Herodotus, Greek historian. 480 to 425 is when he wrote his original history, but the earliest copy we have is from 1,350 years later, and we only have 8 copies. Again, 14 centuries after the autograph. That's a long span of time. Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. 460 to 400 BC, the earliest copy is 13 centuries later, and we have 8 copies. What do you do if these 8 copies have drastic differences in them? How do you reconstruct the original? You only have 8 copies. It's not like you can just go down to the library and Dewey Decimal System and find a bunch more. All you have is 8. And if they're drastically different, man, this is hard to go on. You have to choose, well, what did these guys actually say? Hard to know. Plato, a number of his writings, from 400 to 350 BC, again, 13 centuries later, the earliest copy that we have, and we have 7 copies. Plato, heralded as one of the greatest Greek philosophers, and of all the things that he wrote, we only have 7 copies available.
Now, how is that classified? 7 ancient copies? In other words, 7 handwritten copies? Because, I mean, obviously there have been copies of the ancient copies made.
Yes, of course. You can go to Barnes & Noble today and find a copy of Plato's works, right?
So I wonder what the cutoff is on that, you know.
Well,
how old it has to be before it's considered.
Right, and of course with the advent of Gutenberg and the printing press, clearly you can make copies faster, but even then they're only making mass-produced copies of the copies that they have, which, you know, of course are handwritten. So look at the last 2 columns especially. These are the really important pieces of information. How many years between the original autograph and the earliest copy? And in some cases, it's 13, 14 centuries. And then the final column, the number of copies that we have available. And you say, where are these copies? Well, they're all over the world. They're in museums, and some of them are in private collections in people's homes. You can go to the Louvre in France, or the British Museum, or the museum in Berlin, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. They're all over the place. That's where all these copies are. But there's just so few of them. Now, contrast that. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one more. I thought the New Testament documents were next. Okay, Pliny the Younger wrote Natural History, 61 to 113 AD. The earliest copy is almost 8 centuries later, and we have 7 copies. or available. That word extant means at hand, okay? We have 7 copies of Pliny the Younger's Natural History. Contrast this now with the documents of the New Testament. This will blow your mind. The New Testament authors who wrote the New Testament, they wrote it between 50 and 95 AD. How many years passed to the earliest copy that we have? At most 50 years. And how many copies of the New Testament do we have? 5,686, and that's just the Greek. We're not counting the Latin copies, of which there are thousands. We're not counting the Syriac and the Coptic versions. This is just the Greek textual evidence for the New Testament. So when the textual scholar sits down to reconstruct the New Testament, he doesn't have just 7 copies to work from that came 10 centuries after the original. He has nearly 6,000 copies to work from, some of which are written 1 generation after the autograph. This is incredible. And this speaks to the power and the providence of God. God has made it so that His words are preserved. He has made it so there are more copies of His Word thousands of times over than any other ancient text in existence. Far surpassing anything else that's ever been written in ancient history, God has preserved the Scripture for us. And when the textual scholars sit down to reconstruct the New Testament, they have all of these Greek manuscripts at their disposal, and they can accurately figure out what the autographs said. Scholars tell us that of all of the words in the New Testament, and that number escapes me at the moment, I'm wanting to say it's over 38,000 words in the New Testament. Don't quote me on that though. But of all the words in the New Testament, there are only about 100 words that are disputed, meaning we're not sure if that's what was originally written. Only about 100 words. How much is 100 words? It's like the first paragraph on the document I'm going to give you. It's nothing. I think this is a really faith-building chart, a really great exercise for us to see. And in addition to all the Greek manuscripts, we have nearly 20,000 copies from other languages. So we have over 25,000 copies of the Scripture, ancient documents, ancient to medieval documents, pre-Gutenberg. Over 20,000. That's amazing. You can trust what your Bible says because God has made it so that His Word has been preserved. So, I've got a bunch of pictures I want to show you of what some of these ancient copies look like. But before I shift to that, let me just turn it back to you and ask, do you have questions or is there something that you'd like for me to talk about again? Kelly?
Obviously, I'm not asking let's go through all 100 words, but of those 100 words, are any of them ones that like really...
None of them go to the root of Christian foundational doctrines. None of them. I'll give you an example. Everybody get your Bible, turn to Mark chapter 16. Some of you may be familiar with this. Mark chapter 16, there are some ancient versions of Mark 16 that stop at verse 8. That's the end of Mark's gospel. Mark 16, verse 8. Look at verse 9. Does your Bible have a bracket maybe at the beginning of verse 9, or maybe a footnote that points you to the bottom of the page or something like that? Okay, let's look at this. I've got the New American Standard Version, And in verse 9, all the way down through the rest of the book, verse 20, I have a bracket there as well. That whole section, verses 9 through 20. And if I look at the footnote there, yours will say something like this: later MSS. That's abbreviation for manuscripts. Later manuscripts add verses 9 through 20. Now, I'll show you specifically what that comes from in just a moment as we talk about some of these pictures that I've got to show you. But the short form of that is there are some ancient Greek copies that we have that do not contain verses 9 through 20. You say, well, then why is it in there? Well, because there are also some ancient Greek copies that do have it in there. All right? So the textual critic has to make a decision. Am I going to put it in, or am I going to leave it out? And so what they've decided to do is put it in, but then distinguish it somehow using brackets and footnotes from the rest of the text. Just to say, hey, you should know, not everybody thinks this is original, but we're putting it in, and you can decide that for yourself. And that's what they should do, instead of just leaving it out, okay? But let's just take Mark chapter 16. To Kelly's question, do any of these disputed texts shake the foundations of Christianity? No. If you take out verses 9 through 20, look at what verse suddenly disappears. Verse 16. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. That's like our verse, right? I mean, what do we do if we don't have Mark 16:16? Well, I'll tell you what we do. You go to Acts 2:38. You go to Acts chapter 8 and the eunuch. You go to Acts 9 and Saul of Tarsus. You go to Acts 10 with the Cornelius, the Gentile. You go to Acts 6. We can go to a whole bunch of other places and talk about baptism all we want. We don't, our whole faith doesn't hinge upon Mark 16:16. Okay? Or if we take out this section, oh man, we lose verse 17 and 18 that talks about the miracles that the apostles would perform and how they would go out and they could pick up snakes and drink poison and nothing will happen to them. Okay, the book of Acts is filled with examples of the apostles going out and performing miracles. So what if we lose Mark 16, 17, and 18? We can confirm these things using other passages. Okay? All right, Kelly? Yeah, it's in Luke, it's in Matthew. That's right. We don't lose anything, okay? All right. Now, this would be much more critical if there was only one passage in the New Testament that said, you know, if you want to be saved, you have to be baptized in water for the remission of your sins. If there was only one passage that said that and it was disputed, that would be a much bigger deal, right? Okay, good question. I'll show you an example of an early copy in just a moment that does not contain this section. Or I'll show you a reference to it. All right, so let's talk about some of these ancient documents. Here is an early papyrus of Homer's Iliad. Written originally in 800 BC, this parchment is from the 2nd century AD, so 1,000 years later. But this is what it looks like. Now notice, Homer's Iliad is really long. This is just a small little piece, a small fragment of a parchment. But this is what Homer's Iliad in ancient Greek, classical Greek, looked like. All right? This is probably one of the most significant finds of the last century. The John Rylands P papyrus, short P, 52. Papyrus fragment number 52. This is a fragment of John's Gospel from 125 AD. We believe John most likely wrote his Gospel probably in the early 90s AD. So we're talking here next generation after John's autograph. Now, this is a tiny little fragment. It's like if you were to go to the museum and see it, it's about this big. It's tiny. But it's still from that time period. And this is the earliest, one of the earliest copies that we have, fragments of copies. And here you can see I've got the quoted text It's from John chapter 18 when Jesus is before Pilate and they're having their exchange. So you say you're a king and you say rightly that I'm a king. You probably remember that exchange. All right, and you can go see that in the United Kingdom. All right, this is a papyrus Greek copy from the 3rd century AD of Luke's Gospel, specifically chapters 11 through 13. And why is it all torn and tattered and all that? Well, it's just deteriorated over time, but this was a part of a codex. You remember talking about the codex? They would take these pages and fold them and then stitch them together, and you can see where this was folded and stitched, right? You can see how that opens up like a book, like a centerfold. So that's from Luke's Gospel in the Chester Beatty Papyri collection. Another example from that collection, this is a papyrus of 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 through 15 from the 3rd century AD. That one looks to be in really good shape, doesn't it? All right. Same collection. This is a Coptic version of John's Gospel. John chapters 10 and 11 from 300 to 350 AD, somewhere in that time frame. And then there's some smaller segmented portions that have been torn away from the page. Look how they used the whole page, right? It's complete top to bottom, left to right. They didn't waste any of that papyrus.
So is the technical critic actually looking at this fragment?
Yes.
Oh, what a job.
What a job. That's right. Well, and this is a Coptic version or Syriac, so you have to know that language in order to work backwards. Hey.
One thing we talk about the thousands. I mean, it wasn't like all these were found at once.
That's right.
Like so much of evidence is, it's interesting how, I mean, it shouldn't surprise us, I guess, but how people have doubts about maybe they were doubting passage and all of a sudden, oops, here comes this manuscript that they find.
Mm-hmm.
It confirms something that allows them to get more information, just like with all of evidence. It just always gets proven every time there's a doubt. All of a sudden, something gets found.
Yeah, that's right. When we say that there's 5,700 Greek manuscripts, we're not saying that in the 5th century AD, someone could go to the Ancient Greek Historical Society vault and walk in and find 5,700 copies of Greek text. That's not what we mean. Over time, as archaeologists have discovered more and so forth, we've found 5,700. But what we consistently find is that the newer documents that we find and unearth, they confirm what we've thought the scriptures have said all of this time. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the classic example of that, just this treasure trove of ancient documents that all confirmed the Old Testament scriptures, especially the book of Isaiah. If you want to do some fascinating reading, just Google search Dead Sea Scrolls, Scroll of Isaiah, and that'll just blow your mind. All right. Now, I put 3 websites up here. I've got them in the handout I'm going to give you, so you don't have to write these down. I strongly encourage you to go to these 3 websites. What these are, the first and the third one are collections. Chester Beatty collection, which I've shown you some pictures from that. And then the third one is the John Rylands collection. Chester Beatty and John Rylands were academics, scholars, who made it their life's goal to collect as many ancient papyrus documents as they could get their hands on. Okay? And they came up with some incredible stuff. And all of their collections have been digitized. And you can go on these websites and you can look at them. Like you can zoom in and you can scan all of these fragments and copies. I know they're in a different language, but man, you're looking at history right on the internet, right there. Go on those websites, look at the biblical collection of documents. They have other collections too of ancient, historical, secular things, but go look at those documents. You can easily, as I did this week, spend an hour or 2 just sitting there with your mouth open at what you see. Do it with your kids. Talk to them about this. This is really fascinating stuff, and it would really help them understand some of these ideas that we're talking about in class as well. This one, I don't know if I have a real strong internet signal down here. I'm going to try to open this up. I don't know that I'm going to be able to do it. But this second website is codexsinaiticus.org. Codex, which we've talked about that. Codex Sinaiticus, and that name tells you it refers to the region in which it was discovered. All right? It is a complete codex of the entire Bible from the 3rd century AD. It's one of the oldest complete versions that we have. I don't think I've got a strong enough internet signal to open it up. But if you go to this website, again, it's in the notes, type it in your browser, you can see a digitized version of Codex Sinaiticus. And you can, at the top, you type in, I want to go to John chapter 6 and verse 12, and boom, it'll take you right there. You can zoom in, you can scroll around, and again, just sit there gaping at it with your mouth open because it is so cool. And you'll notice that what you see when you open it up is that everything that I've talked to you about how they made ancient books and how the scribes would make copies and they would do these 3-inch wide columns, and it's all there on Codex Sinaiticus. Absolutely fascinating. Okay. Questions? I'm done. Craig's sitting there with his mouth open right now. He hadn't even seen the stuff yet.
Any way to, and this is kind of digging into the weeds a little bit, when we talk about copies, so, we're trying to figure out, and there's no way to really know that, obviously, the number of years to the earliest copies are probably our best indication of it, but when we talk about copies, so it's one thing to talk about a copy of the autograph, it's another thing to talk about a copy of a copy.
Right.
So, and there really isn't. I think the years is probably our best bet. Is there any way to figure out, we've got 56, that's great. Or is there any way to figure out sort of a number of those copies that potentially could at least be, or have a better chance of being copies of the original? And obviously, really, we don't. I think the numbers, the date between when that earliest copy shows up is probably our best indicator.
That's right.
And I guess where I'm going with that is you kind of go, man, we've got 10 copies of Caesar. If we knew for sure, as an example, just sort of devil's advocate, well, those 10 copies were copies of the original autograph, I would be more impressed with that than I would be 30,000 copies of something that's simply copies of copies. Because at some point, if you have mistakes in there, you're simply making a copy of the same. You're not getting additional information to be able to put the things together. And so, and again, I guess where we get to is the dates of where that earliest copy shows up is really our best, because we really have no way to know how many of those 5,600, probably a small number, but what number of those potentially could be copies of the actual original.
Sure.
We kind of don't know, and we're really just going by that years to say, hey, we've got a better opportunity and a better chance the shorter number of years we have, effectively.
No, it's a great point, and there's two things. The first one is, as you said, how many years of time have separated. And the lower that number is, then the more confidence we can have. But the second thing, too, is the scribes who made these copies were meticulous and painstakingly careful. I think I mentioned the Masoretes in one of the earlier classes. They copied the Old Testament scriptures. They knew, when I get to the bottom of page 1, I should be on this letter. And if I'm not, they burned that copy. That's how meticulous they were. And so that speaks to not only do we have early versions like that Ryland's 52 fragment, which is not much, but still, it's early, but we also have the thousands of the copies made by such scribes. These are not thousands of copies made by men who were careless. These were people who believed they were writing the very words of God, and they wanted to be as careful as they possibly could. And so what you end up finding over time as you look at these thousands of copies that are spanning over multiple centuries, yeah, but so many of them say the same thing. How is that possible unless you're just extremely meticulous in the copying of it?